Support for this podcast comes from the Central Valley Journalism Collaborative, connecting communities with the resources, infrastructure, and networks to ensure a vibrant local free press.
From KVPR in Fresno, this is Central Valley Daily. It's Wednesday, November 6th. I'm Elizabeth Arkalian. Coming up, Election Day is behind us now, and so are the long lines many voters braved to cast their ballots.
We heard from voters who felt that long lines meant democracy is working, people are participating, and voters who felt going in person was the only way to ensure their votes were counted.
We hear analysis about some key races, but first, these election reports from the KVPR newsroom. All eyes are on California's 22nd congressional district in the southern San Joaquin Valley. It's one of a handful that could determine which party controls the House next year. Early results show Republican incumbent David Valadao with 55% of the vote and Democratic challenger Rudy Salas with 45%. KVPR's Joshua Yeager reports on the race, which is considered a toss-up.
Salas received a thunderous response at his election party in Bakersfield. The Democrat said he was counting on boosted turnout to unseat his Republican rival.
I feel really good about where we're at. Knocking on over 250,000 doors, making over 1 million phone calls into the district.
Even though Biden carried this district by double digits, voters like Sandeep Castro have helped keep the Republican Valadao in office for most of the past decade.
In their debate, I've seen a lot of action that Valadao has taken, and I don't see too much action that Rudy Salas has taken.
Both candidates have tried to appeal to a broad range of voters. Valadao has separated himself from national Republicans on key issues like immigration, while Salas has touted a history of working across the aisle in the state assembly. For KVPR News, I'm Joshua Yeager in Bakersfield.
The results for Congressional District 13, which spans Merced County and parts of 3 others, shows another close race. It's between Republican incumbent John Duarte and his challenger, Democrat Adam Gray. As of this morning, John Duarte was ahead with 51% of the vote. KVPR's Rachel Livenall visited parties for both last night and brings us a sense of the mood.
Perhaps a 6-year-old and an 8-year-old best represent the split among voters in this race. I asked them who they wanted to win.
I would pick Adam Gray. John Duarte.
Mason, 6, and Jameson, 8, are friends. One of their mothers brought them to a watch party for Duarte. Sure, they're young, but their differences represent how tight this race has been. Hundreds of votes separated the candidates in the last election, and once again, they're holding their breaths. Here's Gray.
There's probably going to be over 200,000 votes cast in this election.
And Duarte.
These are very close races, and the votes have to be counted.
One Gray supporter said she wants someone in Congress who can work across the aisle, and a voter in Duarte's camp appreciates his support for veterans. The pivotal race for the House generated millions in spending on advertisements and campaigning. For KVPR News, I'm Rachel Livenall.
As the election comes to a close in our deeply purple valley, elected officials are eager to put the races behind them. KVPR's Esther Quintanilla roamed the Fresno area to find some bipartisanship amid what's looking like a national lead for the GOP.
Fresno Mayor Jerry Dyer is a Republican, and so some were surprised when he showed up at a watch party for the local Democratic Party, and even mingled with voters in front of a life-size cutout of Kamala Harris. But Dyer, who holds a nonpartisan office, saw it differently. He told KVPR he hopes that his appearance would signal unity and bipartisanship through this highly politicized election cycle.
Extremism has gotten our country in a lot of trouble, and at times gotten our city in trouble.
At his own watch party, Democratic Congressman Jim Acosta felt similarly. No matter which party controls Congress, he said he's looking forward to working together.
We need to remember that these constant pointing fingers and blaming people doesn't solve anyone's problems.
For KVPR News, I'm Esther Quintanilla.
The results of the race for U.S. president left many in shock last night after the polls had been showing a very tight race between Donald Trump and Kamala Harris. One of those struggling to make sense of the results was Kat Anderson. She's a canvasser from the Bay Area who'd been spending time trying to help Valley Democrats get elected.
I thought it would turn out differently. I thought Kamala ran a really great campaign, and I thought that things were going to go differently for the Democrats.
Although California overall swung for Harris, Valley Republicans say dissatisfaction with the economy and immigration led them to vote for Trump.
Getting rid of an old car can be a pain, especially if it's in disrepair. But fear not, the KVPR vehicle donation program is here to help. We'll tow away that old vehicle and use the proceeds to support the news you rely on. And we accept all kinds of vehicles, including motorcycles, boats, and RVs. Learn more at kvpr.org/cars.
And now to our main story, the election. It's the morning after, and no, we are not here to talk about the presidential election. We'll leave that to our colleagues at NPR and beyond. Instead, we want to share what the elections looked and sounded like last night right here in the San Joaquin Valley. As you heard, our KVPR reporters were spread out across the region, speaking with voters, candidates, and elected officials in Merced, Fresno, and Bakersfield. They also captured the mood at watch parties. And so for this episode, we're doing something a little different. I'll be handing it over to two members of the KVPR newsroom. News Director Cresencio Rodriguez-Delgado, who interviewed our associate editor, Kerry Klein. They talked about our local observations and analysis from election night. They recorded this in the early hours of the morning before going home and getting some much-needed sleep.
So, Kerry, let's back up a little bit to the earlier part of election night. Our reporters, Rachel Livenall, Esther Quintanilla, and Joshua Yeager, they started the evening speaking to voters before the polls closed. So what was the mood around the valley at that point?
At that point, it was largely upbeat, though, of course, by the end of the night, that depended which party people were supporting. But people we spoke with were, pretty excited to cast their ballots, and many were content to wait in very long lines at voting centers. One polling place in Merced still had 300 people in line at 7 p.m., with only an hour left before polls closed. We heard from voters who felt that long lines meant democracy is working, people are participating, and voters who felt going in person was the only way to ensure their votes were counted. Though, of course, there's been no evidence of voter tampering or of mail-in ballots not being counted anywhere. And we spoke to sheriff's offices all over our coverage area, and in every county here in this part of the San Joaquin Valley, they told us that voting went off without any dangerous or suspicious incidents. So that's a really nice high point from the evening.
Exactly. That certainly is really good to hear. So, and the voter data that you looked at also suggests that many people were interested in this election, right?
Yeah, likely yes. I mean, we don't know just yet what voter turnout looked like in terms of hard data, but going into the election, voter registration was up relative to the primary earlier this year. State data show about 3% more people had registered for this election than they had for the primary in the San Joaquin Valley. And since turnout is typically much stronger for the general than the primary in any given year, it's pretty safe to say people showed up last night in numbers much higher than they did in March.
Wow, very interesting. Okay, so and then moving a little bit later into the evening, our reporters attended different watch parties, in Bakersfield, Fresno, and Merced for a handful of local races. So what did they find there?
I mean, it was a whole assortment of candidates, of course, running for office here and there, voters who were attending the parties, and then also, other officials or maybe even celebrities that were attending these parties too. So reporter Esther Quintanilla spoke with Gary Bredefeld. He's currently a Fresno City Council member and is running for a Fresno County Supervisor seat. He was optimistic. He touted his ground game as strong. Trump fever was also very strong there, with lots of American flags, cowboy hats, and MAGA shirts. Bredefeld has waged a tough campaign against incumbent Steve Brandow, also a Republican. We'll see where that ends up. But it shows you the way some local seats are going through kind of a shakeup in this election. The watch party for Fresno County Democrats was very different, with a cardboard cutout of Vice President Kamala Harris. Many folks there talked up their plans for reaching across the aisle, including Jerry Dyer. Our reporters also ran into Leticia Perez, who's running for re-election as a Kern County supervisor. In Bakersfield, Joshua Yeager also ran into Leticia Perez, who's running for re-election as a Kern County supervisor, as well as civil rights activist Dolores Huerta, who's been supporting Rudy Salas in his run against David Valadeo for Congress.
Okay, so lots of activity and a very busy night for a lot of people. So there were several congressional races in the Valley, but we have 2 swing congressional districts that we were paying very close attention to. Those are seats that potentially could flip when all the votes are counted. We know Republicans have already taken control of the Senate, at least those are the projections, but the House is still contested, and campaign spending for these Valley House races has been enormous. So tell me more about these districts and why are they so important?
Yeah. So, listeners heard stories about both of these swing districts from Rachel Livenall and Joshua Yeager at the top of this podcast. There are a lot of parallels between these 2 races. They're both held by Republicans, and both are being challenged for the second time by Democrats who used to serve in the state legislature. Congressional District 22 is in the South Valley. It includes parts of Kern, Kings, and Tulare counties. One thing that makes it interesting is that the incumbent Republican David Valadao is more centrist than a lot of his party. He even was one of the few Republicans to vote to impeach Trump after the January 6th riots. Rudy Salas, his Democratic challenger, has also cast a few votes that paint him as leaning more toward the middle than the left. Congressional District 13 is in the northern San Joaquin Valley, and it includes Merced County and parts of Fresno, Stanislaus, and San Joaquin counties. It was incredibly close in 2022, and it's incredibly close again.
Okay, and speaking of the House, what's the status of Congressman Vince Fong? Because he was running in a congressional race of his own, but there's also this odd thing where his name was actually in 2 races. So what's going on there, and was he winning in any of those races?
Yeah, it is a conundrum because it looks like he is winning both of those races. I mean, to recap, Fong was formerly an assembly member. He was already running for re-election for his state seat last year when former House Speaker Kevin McCarthy resigned from Congress in House District 20. Fong decided to run for that seat to fill the rest of McCarthy's term, and then he would get on the ballot again for the next congressional term, which is the race that he just won last night. But by the time he threw his hat in the ring for Congress at all the first time, it was too late to withdraw from his assembly run. And so even though he was on the ballot running for the seat in Congress, and he even won the special election earlier this year, his name remained on the ballot in both races for this most recent election. Right now, he is the clear winner in his congressional run, as expected. And even though the assembly votes have not all been counted, he is likely to win that race as well against Ken Weir, a Republican city council member from Bakersfield. And so as for what's next, it's not clear. We even posed this question to California's Secretary of State, Shirley Weber, who handles voting in the state, and she was not sure what will happen and how to rectify this situation. So that will be one to follow in coming weeks for sure. Though one thing is clear, Fong cannot be in both seats at the same time, figuratively or literally.
Wow. Okay. So this definitely has been a interesting wild saga to follow, and we will try to continue to make sense of it for our listeners, along with all the other races that we saw here in the Central Valley. So thank you so much, Kerry, for all this important context.
Yeah, you're welcome.
That was a conversation between KVPR's Kerry Klein and Cresencio Rodriguez-Delgado, who manage the KVPR newsroom. And that does it for today's episode. Thanks so much for listening. Jonathan Linden, Kerry Klein, and Cresencio Rodriguez-Delgado produced today's episode with help from the entire KVPR newsroom. I'm Elizabeth Arkalian. Find the latest local news anytime at kvpr.org.
No matter what happens in Washington, the NPR Politics Podcast is here for you. For the latest news, insights, and analysis from the election and beyond, listen to the NPR Politics Podcast.